Just the mention of his name can send a chill up the spine. In a place full of horror, he was the most feared monster of them all. We're of course talking about the angel of death, Josef Mengele. Although trained as a doctor to preserve life, he brought a sadistic cruelty to the experiments that ended the lives of so many. And his victims of choice? Well, they were children. In this week's Biographics, we reveal the depraved life of the monster of Auschwitz, Dr. Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele entered the world on the 16th of March 1911 in the German Bavarian town of Günzburg. After 3 miscarriages, he was the firstborn of Karl and Perger Mengele. Karl was the owner of a farm machine factory which turned to producing munitions when war broke out in 1914. The Mengeles would go on to have 2 more sons, but Josef was the firm favorite of his mother. Walpurga was an obese woman who had a stern reputation and a voracious appetite. She doted on her eldest son and was much closer to him than she was to her husband. For his part, Josef proved to be a quiet child whose main goal was to please his overbearing mother. At school, Josef, he was an average student. He struggled to keep his grades up at the standard that his mother expected, and when he was 15, he contracted the serious bone marrow disease, osteomyelitis. The disease, which was often fatal in those days, kept him off school for 6 months. Returning to class, he was seriously behind his peers academically. Over the next 2 years, he showed a remarkable level of self-discipline to not only catch up, but surpass many of his fellow students. By the age of 17, he had outgrown his shyness and developed into a handsome, focused, and driven young man who was popular with both teachers and classmates. In April 1930, the 19-year-old passed his high school exams and gained acceptance into the medical and philosophy faculties at Munich University. He had decided to become a doctor. Mengele stood out from the other men on campus. He was always impeccably dressed and had developed the air of a gentleman. He treated women with old-fashioned dignity and was a very good dancer. All these traits got him quickly noticed by the ladies, with the result that his social calendar was usually pretty full. During his first year of university, Mengele began to show an interest in politics. He joined the Steel Helmets in March of 1931, a paramilitary group who advocated a return to the pre-war monarchy. The Steel Helmets were a stepping stone in the National Socialist or Nazi Party, which was promoted in beer halls as well as on university campuses. The Nazis advocated a return of German pride and pureness and the removal of racial impurities. These ideas, they appealed to Mengele and seemed to mesh with the social Darwinism that he thought was being taught in the lecture halls. He became fascinated with eugenics, particularly the idea that a population could be made more perfect through selective breeding of those who had the most desirable characteristics. It would also help to weed out undesirable traits by the elimination of the weak and the feeble. While the Nazis believed in eugenics, for them the process of generational selective breeding, it was too slow. They were determined to weed out the weak right now. The Aryan race could simply no longer stand being contaminated by inferior races such as the Slavs and the Jews, both of whom were considered Untermensch or subhuman. These beliefs were enthusiastically embraced by the young and impressionable Josef Mengele. In 1935, Mengele was awarded a PhD in anthropology. His thesis was entitled Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw Section of 4 Racial Groups. The paper was free of any racial bias and set out to prove empirically by science alone that the German was of superior breeding and a better human being. A year later, Mengele graduated with a medical degree. He spent 4 months as an intern at Leipzig University Clinic before joining the staff of Germany's leading racial expert. This was Dr. Omar Freiherr von Verscher, and he was based at the Institute for Heredity, Biology and Racial Purity, located at the University of Frankfurt. Mengele's job at the institute was to examine people who were suspected of breaking the Nuremberg laws to see whether or not they were Jews. He and his colleagues created thousands of files which would turn out to be devastating in future years when people were rounded up for transportation to concentration camps. In May of 1937, Mengele officially joined the Nazi Party. He became a member of the Nazi Doctors' Party and then, in May of 1938, the Schutzstaffen, or SS. The SS had been created as Hitler's personal protection squad, but had expanded its role to the running of concentration camps. The leader of the SS was Heinrich Himmler, a meticulous organizer who had plans to make the still small organization as powerful as the National Army. At the time Mengele joined, the SS was an elite group that only allowed the best specimens of Aryan manhood into its ranks. At about the same time as he became a member of the SS, Mengele became engaged to Irene Schoenbein, the daughter of a professor at Frankfurt University. 6 years younger than Josef, Irene was a blonde-haired beauty and made the perfect complement to the handsome, athletic-looking young doctor. When it came to getting married, however, there was a bit of a problem. While Josef was able to show documentation of his Aryan purity, Irene could not prove that her grandfather was 100% Aryan. It was only the influence of the Mengele family that smoothed the way for the wedding, which took place in July of 1939. The failure to fully prove Irene's ancestry precluded the Mengeles from inclusion in the kinship book of the SS, which included couples who could prove their Aryan ancestry back to 1750. As a result, Mengele was deprived of the Swords and Spoons Award, which was given to an SS man on the birth of a child. After just 3 months of marriage, Mengele was called for a 3-month stint in the army. He was sent to the Tyrolean mountain region. Possessing a high level of physical fitness and being an adept hiker, he excelled in his service. Having completed his 3-month service, he returned to his job at Frankfurt University. But with the coming of war in 1939, national mobilization was instituted. Mengele was rejected on the first draft because he had had a kidney infection as a child. In June of 1940, Mengele was finally called up, becoming a second lieutenant in the Waffen-SS. He was put in a no-combat position, working in the genealogical section of the Race and Resettlement Office. By June of 1941, with the onset of Operation Barbarossa, there was an urgent need for men to serve on the Eastern Front. Mengele was pulled out of the office and sent to the Russian front. He proved to be a courageous soldier, winning the Iron Cross, second class. At the beginning of 1942, Mengele transferred to the Scandinavian Viking SS Division, where he served as a field doctor. Again, he proved his courage under fire, winning the Iron Cross First Class when he pulled 2 men from a burning tank. In November of 1942, he suffered serious wounds and was taken off the front lines. After a period of recovery, he returned to the Race and Resettlement Office. He gained a promotion to captain and then in mid-1943 was given what was to him a dream job. This was a practical eugenics researcher. This meant that he was able to indulge all of the wackiest eugenics theories, testing them out on living human subjects. The human subjects who would be Mengele's guinea pigs were to be found at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. He obtained a posting to the camp and set about extending his anthropological research into heredity. Mengele was not the first doctor to use concentration camp inmates for research purposes. In Birkenwald and Dachau, Jews were injected with bacteria, exposed to all manner of deadly diseases, and struck with rifle butts repeatedly to see how long it would take for them to suffer irreversible brain damage. At Auschwitz itself, Dr. Horst Schumann had been conducting sterilization experiments, once castrating 90 men in a single day. Yet Mengele was to take the scope and barbarity of his experiments to an entirely new level. Auschwitz had been elected as the venue for his work because of its out-of-the-way location and because it was close to a railway junction with tracks coming from all over Europe. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz on the 23rd of May, 1943. The next day he participated in his first selection. This involved selecting which of the new inmate arrivals were to live and which were to die. On that day alone, he sent 1,035 gypsies to the gas chamber. As was his nature, Mengele was impeccably dressed during these selections. He wore a white SS medical uniform, white gloves, and polished black boots. His face was emotionless as he decided who was to die by a simple flick of his wrist. His constant chain-smoking and air of nonchalance presented a mystifying yet terrifying sight for the bewildered new arrivals. During his time at Auschwitz, Mengele oversaw selection on 74 transports. 80% of new arrivals were condemned to death immediately. All children under the age of 14 were killed, as were the old and the infirm. Mengele seemed to enjoy this aspect of his job, and he was known to say, "Here the Jews enter through the doors and leave through the chimney." Mengele's passion, however, was for scientific research. He instructed the guards to seek out those who were deformed, overly tall, midgets, or who were lame. His most prized subjects were twins, especially if they were children. From his earliest days at university, Mengele had a fascination with twins. He believed that by studying them, he could discover the secret to genetic manipulation. Indeed, it was his search for twins that motivated him to attend so many arrival selections. During his time at Auschwitz, he managed to find 1,500 pairs of twins that were used as human guinea pigs. Only 100 pairs survived. The twins and other research subjects who were selected on arrival would be marched to living quarters at the Birkenau, about 2 miles away. There they lived in appalling conditions, surrounded by rotting corpses and starving adults. Once established in their disgraceful living quarters, the children had to complete an intensive questionnaire in which they had to indicate their age, height, eye and hair color, ethnic background, as well as any health problems. Older children assisted young ones to complete the forms, desperate to have everything completed to the satisfaction of the guards. Children would then be interviewed by Mengele himself, who would take extensive notes and then have a file for each child drawn up. He was determined to have his research seen as legitimate, and so he went to great lengths to keep everything official. In preparation for experimentation, the children were cleaned, bathed, and dressed in clean pajamas. They were then taken by Red Cross vehicles to one of Mengele's research laboratories. He had established a number of labs around the Auschwitz-Birkenau area for these specific purposes. At one, blood tests and x-rays were taken. Here the children were treated with care. Mengele would come in regularly to make sure that none were being mistreated. On these occasions, he would hand out sweets to the children and talk gently and reassuringly to them. By doing this, he was able to engender trust, which got the children onto his experimentation table. In other labs, the most heinous barbarism was taking place on a daily basis. Anesthesia was never used, so the pain that was inflicted on the children can hardly even be imagined. Experiments included the removal of specific organs or limbs, immersion in freezing water, the injection of dyes into the eyes, the castration of boys, sterilization of girls, and deliberate infection of wounds with gangrene. Occasionally, Mengele would organize endurance test experiments. This involved subjects being given increasingly strong voltages of electricity until they either died, became unconscious, or went into a coma. As soon as a twin died, its sibling would immediately be killed in order to provide comparative data during the autopsies. Despite Mengele's attempts to cloak his work in legitimacy, there was no valid scientific reason for any of these horrendous experiments. Doctors who assisted Mengele later recorded that it seemed as if many of the experiments were just inspired purely by sadism. In addition to his diabolical lab work and to selection duties with new arrivals, Mengele occasionally delivered babies. Women who were found to be pregnant were immediately gassed. However, if they were near full term, Mengele would deliver the baby, only to be sent with its mother to death. One of his greatest amusements was to allow for them both to live for some time, but to tape the mother's breasts so that she would be forced to watch her baby starve to death. Of all of his atrocities, the worst occurred when he had a pit dug and a massive fire lit in the yard at Birkenau. He then had 300 children, all under the age of 5, thrown into the flames. Unlike the majority of Nazi killers, Mengele did not have to be drugged or drunk in order to carry out his murderous work. In fact, according to Jewish survivors who were forced to assist in the laboratories, he was enthusiastic in his infliction of cruelty. At times, his temper would flare and exhibit itself with sharp bursts of horror. On one occasion, he smashed an old man's skull open simply because he wanted to be on his son's work detail. Within the camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau, Mengele had unlimited power. This, combined with his natural sadism, turned him into a monster. He was often accompanied on his rounds by his female equal, SS guard Irma Gresser, a 21-year-old blonde beauty who was almost as depraved as he was. The two of them marched around the camp in immaculate uniform, the perfect Aryan couple. Mengele's hatred for the Jews knew no bounds. He would celebrate Jewish holy days such as Yom Kippur by ordering the gassing of 1,000 children. But his extreme prejudice could not prevent feelings of lust from arising within him on occasion when naked young women were paraded in front of him. On one occasion, a beautiful 15-year-old Jewish girl from Transylvania stood in front of him. Mengele was clearly aroused by the girl. Obviously torn inside, he had the girl selected for special experimentation. Over the next hour, he caused such deformity to her body that she resembled an old, decrepit hag. He then left her to die, having overcome his illicit lust. By early 1944, Mengele had taken to adopting a child. Invariably, the little boy would physically resemble him and would be dressed in a small white medical uniform. Mengele would walk around the camp, hand in hand with the child, providing him with sweets and toys. Within a month, the doctor would tire of the child and led him, still hand in hand, to the gas chamber. The crueler than Mengele was in the conducting of his duties, the more respect he got in the Nazi hierarchy. In a report written at the end of 1944, Auschwitz camp commandant Rudolf Hess wrote that Mengele carried out all tasks given to him, often under very difficult conditions, to the complete satisfaction of his superiors, often using his little off-duty time to utilize the scientific material at his disposal to make valuable contribution to anthropological science. By early 1945, Mengele was at the height of his power. Yet, he could also read the writing on the wall. He knew that the war was soon lost and that the Russians would overrun the camp. In early January, the crematoria had been blown up and healthy prisoners were being force-marched to new destinations in Germany. Mengele continued his experiments until the last minute, but then he busied himself in shipping out all of his equipment, documents, and reports. Then, on January 17, 1945, Josef Mengele simply disappeared from Auschwitz. 10 days later, the Russians arrived. They discovered a burnt-out horror factory. The place had been set on fire and the Germans, like Mengele, had fled. A few thousand survivors, more dead than alive, were found wandering among the ruins. Mengele had fled to another concentration camp further south. Then, as the Russians closed in on that camp, he made for the Mauthausen camp in Austria. When the Allies approached, he ditched his Nazi uniform and went on the run. His freedom, it didn't last long. On May 2nd, he had joined up with a war hospital unit. The unit soon was overrun by the Russians and all the Germans were taken into custody. When arrested, Mengele was wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. He proved to be a bad prisoner, constantly worrying that he would be exposed as an SS officer. With all of the suspected SS men weeded out, he and the other prisoners were handed over to the Americans and then released. The Angel of Death appeared to have escaped scot-free. However, he knew he would be constantly hunted down. He was too afraid to return to his family, so he traveled around West Germany and into Soviet-occupied East Germany. For 3 years, he worked as a laborer on an alpine farm in Bavaria. Meanwhile, the story of Mengele's atrocities had been revealed to the world at large. As a result, he became the most sought-after Nazi scalp by post-war Nazi hunters. He made the decision to flee Europe, walking over the Alps and crossing into Italy in April of 1949. He then made his way to South Tyrol, where he managed to obtain an International Red Cross ID card under a false name. With this, he managed to get a Swiss passport. Mengele then traveled to Genoa, where he set sail for Buenos Aires, Argentina. Upon arriving on Argentinian soil, Mengele finally felt safe. He was taken in by Argentinian President Juan Perón and lived within his palatial compound. Perón had been a longtime supporter of Hitler and had opened up his country to fleeing Nazis. Mengele established a comfortable life in Argentina. He found work as a carpenter, a trade at which he proved to be adept. He was also a highly respected member of the local Nazi community. By now, his father was extremely wealthy as a result of his business ventures. The old man financed international rendezvous, usually at skiing resorts. Absent from these family get-togethers was Mengele's wife Irene, who had divorced her husband in absentia. On a family skiing trip to Switzerland in 1956, Mengele charmed his dead brother Karl's widow Martha. A year later, they were married. Martha and her son Rolf moved to Argentina to be with Mengele. With the backing of his father's money, Mengele and his new family, they lived very well. They moved into an upmarket villa in a luxurious suburb, ironically in the midst of many wealthy Jewish families. He felt so confident in his new life that in 1956 he gave up his alias and reverted to his real name. However, a determined handful of Nazi hunters, mainly made up of Holocaust survivors, were hot on his trail. One of them, Hermann Langbein, managed to get a hold of the divorce papers filed by Irene. They indicated that Mengele was living in Buenos Aires. Langbein pressured the West German government to issue an arrest warrant, which they did on June 7, 1959. The West German Foreign Ministry now demanded that Mengele be extradited to face the charges. Mengele was warned what was happening and fled to Paraguay. A year later, he moved on to Brazil, where he settled in with a Hungarian couple on a small farm about 300 miles from Sao Paulo. In mid-1962, he moved again, this time to a 45-hectare farm at Sierra Negra, 150 miles north of Sao Paulo, where he bordered with the Strasser family. In his old age, Mengele became arrogant, surly, and self-centered. He treated other people as his intellectual and racial inferiors. In 1964, a war crime trial for Mengele was held in absentia. Throughout the course of the trial, the gruesome details of his experiments were related, often by surviving human guinea pigs. As a result of these revelations, he became a hated figure for the vast majority of West Germans. By 1970, the efforts to get Mengele extradited had petered out, and he had largely been forgotten about. He continued to live an unhappy life with the Strasser family, who had grown to loathe him. In 1976, he suffered a stroke from which he only partially recovered. He finally met his end in February of 1979, suffering a fatal stroke while swimming at the beach in Bertioga. Until the moment he took his last breath, he never uttered a single regret about his actions at Auschwitz. So I really hope you enjoyed that Biographics video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new biographies every Monday and Thursday. Also, I've got another channel, it's called Top 10s. On that channel, as you might have guessed from the name of it, we look at all sorts of interesting top 10 lists. You can check it out through the link on the screen now, but if you're looking for something else to watch right now, why not check out a biography from the archives, or indeed a top 10s video over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.